The rain came through the roof of Ravenscar Castle before Rosalind had even unpacked her first trunk. She stood in the great hall, water dripping onto the stone floor beside her feet, and looked at the man she had married only 3 days before. Geoffrey Lyle was already pulling on his riding gloves. "You cannot mean to leave now," she said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands did. "I have a commission waiting in the east," Geoffrey said, not meeting her eyes. "Surveys for the crown. It cannot wait, Rosalind. This house has stood for 300 years. It will stand a little longer without me. And I am to stand here with it? Alone?" He finally looked at her, and for a moment she thought she saw shame in his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the easy confidence that had won her father's approval, and her own foolish heart. "You have Mrs. Dray. You have the staff. You are clever, Rosalind. Cleverer than most men I know. You will manage." "Manage what? A house with holes in its roof and no money to mend them?" Geoffrey did not answer. He walked past her, out into the courtyard, where his horse stood waiting in the gray morning light. Rosalind followed him to the great doors, her wedding shoes still stiff and new, and watched as he mounted without looking back. From the shadow of the gatehouse, a figure watched them both. Reginald Lyle, Geoffrey's cousin, leaned against the stone wall with his arms folded and a small, satisfied smile on his face. He had come to see Geoffrey off, he claimed. Rosalind suspected he had come to see her fail. "He will not last a year abroad before the money runs out," Reginald said, stepping toward her once Geoffrey had ridden through the gate. "And this house will not last a year without him. You would do well to consider your position, cousin." "I am not your cousin," Rosalind said. "Not yet." Reginald's smile widened. "But if Ravenscar falls to ruin, and Geoffrey does not return to save it, the estate passes to the nearest male heir. That would be me. I would hate for you to be homeless when that day comes, Rosalind. Truly I would." She did not answer him. She turned and walked back into the hall, where Mrs. Dray, her companion since childhood, was already directing 2 maids to set buckets beneath the leaking places in the ceiling. "Do not listen to him," Mrs. Dray said quietly, once Reginald had gone. "He wants you to give up before you have even begun." "I have no intention of giving up," Rosalind said, though she was not entirely certain, in that moment, what giving up would even look like, or what remaining would demand of her. That night, she could not sleep. She lit a candle and walked the halls of Ravenscar alone, counting the damage as she went. Water stains spread across the ceilings like dark clouds. Several of the tapestries had begun to rot where the damp had reached them. In the west wing, an entire floorboard had given way, and she had to step carefully around the gap, holding her candle low to see the drop beneath. She found the estate ledgers in her husband's study, locked in a drawer that gave way easily to a hairpin. What she read there made her sit down hard in the chair behind the desk. The debts were worse than Geoffrey had ever told her. Tenant rents had gone uncollected for 2 seasons. The roof repairs alone would cost more than the entire yearly income of the estate. There was a note, in a hand she did not recognize, mentioning a debt owed to a man named Josiah Corbin, due within the year, with terms that made her stomach turn. She read the ledgers 3 times before she closed them and blew out the candle. The next morning she rose before the sun and walked the grounds herself, wrapped in an old cloak against the cold. The gardens had gone wild. The stables held only 2 horses, both old and half lame. The tenant cottages, when she walked far enough to see them, showed roofs in nearly as poor a state as the castle's own. An old man was mending a fence near the edge of the home farm. He straightened when he saw her coming, and touched his cap, though his eyes were wary. "Good morning," Rosalind said. "I am Lady Lyle. I do not believe we have met." "Cutter, my lady." "I keep the sheep, what's left of them." He said it plainly, without warmth, as though he expected nothing from her, and wished to be proven right. "How many are left?" 40, perhaps. There were near 200, before the old lord passed. "Things have not been kept up, my lady, if you'll forgive my saying so." "I will not only forgive you for saying so," Rosalind said. "I will need you to say it again, and to tell me everything else that has gone wrong here, so that I might begin to put it right." Cutter looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing whether she meant it. Then, slowly, he began to talk. He told her of fields left fallow, of a mill that no longer turned, of tenants who had stopped paying rent because they saw no reason to pour money into a house that gave nothing back. By the time she left him, the sun had fully risen, and Rosalind's cloak was damp with morning dew, but her mind was already turning over what she had heard. She spent the following days in much the same way, walking every corner of the estate she could reach, speaking to every tenant and servant who would speak to her. Some were sullen, Some were openly doubtful that a young bride left behind by her own husband could do anything to help them. But a few, like Cutter, began to soften, drawn by the simple fact that she asked, and that she listened to the answers. It was on one such walk, along the road that led toward the village, that she first saw Daniel Ferris. He was standing at the edge of a half-collapsed bridge that crossed the stream near the mill, sketching something in a small book with quick, sure strokes. He wore no coat, despite the chill, and his sleeves were pushed up past his elbows as though he had been working with his hands not long before. "You are trespassing," Rosalind said, though she said it without real anger, more curious than offended. He looked up, unhurried. "I am admiring my lady, which I hope is a different crime, though I confess I have been studying your bridge for the better part of an hour, and your mill before that. My bridge is falling into the stream." "Yes," he agreed, "and your mill has not turned in perhaps 3 years, judging by the state of the wheel. I am Daniel Ferris. I build things when people will let me, and I mend things when they cannot afford to build new ones. And what would mending my bridge cost me, Mr. Ferris? Less than you fear, and more than you have, I would guess, if the rest of the estate looks anything like this bridge." He closed his sketchbook and studied her properly for the first time, in a way that made her feel he was measuring not just the estate, but her. "Forgive me. That was blunt." "It was honest," Rosalind said. "I have had enough of the other kind this week." He smiled at that, briefly, and something in the smile made her want to see it again. That evening, walking back to the castle in the fading light, Rosalind found herself thinking not of the debts in the ledger, nor of Reginald's cold smile, nor even of Geoffrey riding away without looking back. She thought instead of a man with ink-stained fingers who had looked at her ruined bridge and seen not a broken thing, but a problem waiting to be solved. She did not yet know how much that way of seeing things would come to matter to her. But as she climbed the worn steps of Ravenscar Castle, past the bucket still catching rain from the ceiling above, she found, for the first time since her wedding, something that was not quite hope, but stood very close to it. She spent that evening with Mrs. Dray in the small parlor that still had a dry ceiling, going over the ledgers together by candlelight. Mrs. Dray had a sharper head for numbers than most gave her credit for, and together they made a list of every debt, every unpaid rent, every repair that could not wait past winter. "It looks worse written down than it did in your husband's mouth," Mrs. Dray said at last, setting down her pen. "Everything does," Rosalind said. "That is why men like Geoffrey prefer to speak of things rather than write them. What will you do?" Rosalind looked at the fire, which was burning low, and thought of Cutter's 40 sheep, and the mill that had not turned in 3 years, and the man with ink on his fingers who had looked at a broken bridge as though it were only waiting for someone with the will to fix it. "I will do what he could not," she said. "I will make this place worth saving, with or without him." Mrs. Dray studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though she had been waiting to hear those exact words. "Then we had better start with the roof, my lady, before the whole house comes down around our ears." They both laughed then, a tired, disbelieving sort of laugh, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to do but find something to laugh about. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and through the window Rosalind could see a single star breaking through the clouds above the crumbling towers of Ravenscar. She rose early again the next morning, and this time she carried with her not only her cloak but a small notebook of her own, in which she began to write down every idea that came to her, however small or strange it seemed. By midday she had walked the length of the eastern wall twice, testing the stones with her own hands where they had begun to crumble, and had spoken with 3 more tenants who had not yet decided whether to trust her. It was slow work, and lonely work, and more than once she caught herself wishing Geoffrey had never left at all, or better still, had never needed to be wished for in the first place. But each night she returned to the castle a little less afraid than the night before, and each morning she rose with a little more purpose than the day that had come before it. The following week, a letter arrived from Josiah Corbin, requesting the honor of calling upon her. Rosalind read it twice before she set it aside, a small cold feeling settling in her chest that she could not yet explain, but that she suspected, before long, she would understand all too well. Josiah Corbin arrived at Ravenscar 3 days later, in a carriage far too fine for the muddy road that led to the castle gates. Rosalind watched from an upper window as he climbed down, straightened his coat, and looked up at the crumbling towers with an expression that unsettled her more than any insult could have. He was not looking at the ruin, he was looking at the land. She received him in the great hall, where the fire had been built up higher than usual and every chair that could still bear weight had been arranged to make the room look less bare than it was. Mrs. Dray stood near the door, close enough to hear every word. Lady Lyle, Corbin said, bowing low. What a pleasure to meet you at last. Your husband spoke of you often, before he left. Did he? Rosalind said. I confess I do not know what he might have said, since he did not think to tell me he owed you a debt before he rode away. Corbin's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes sharpened. Business matters. Tedious things, not fit for a lady's ears. Or so I imagine he believed. I am here only to be of service, my lady. I understand the estate finds itself in difficulty. The estate finds itself in need of a roof, Mr. Corbin, not in need of services. Of course, of course. He spread his hands, the picture of reasonableness. But roofs cost money, and I understand money is precisely what Ravenscar lacks. I am prepared to offer a generous sum for the estate, my lady. Enough to settle every debt, with a comfortable amount left over for your own use. You could take a house in town, live free of all this worry. You wish to buy my husband's estate. I wish to relieve you of a burden that no young lady should be forced to carry alone. His voice was smooth as poured cream. It is no small thing, what has been asked of you. Abandoned in a crumbling house, with debts you did not create, and cannot possibly repay. I only wish to help. Rosalind studied him for a long moment before she answered. She thought of the ledgers she had read 3 times over, of Cutter's 40 sheep, of the tenants who had begun, however slowly, to trust her. She thought of the mill that did not turn, and the bridge that a man named Daniel Ferris believed could be mended for less than she feared. I have not decided to sell, Mr. Corbin, she said at last, and I do not believe I will decide to do so today, or tomorrow, or at any time soon. This estate belongs to my husband's family, and until he returns, it is mine to protect. Something flickered across Corbin's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. A noble sentiment. I only hope you will not come to regret it, my lady. Debts do not wait upon sentiment. They come due whether we are ready or not. Then I shall have to be ready, Rosalind said, and rose to signal that the meeting had ended. Corbin bowed again, more stiffly this time, and took his leave. Rosalind watched his carriage rattle back down the muddy road until it disappeared beyond the gatehouse, and only then did she allow her shoulders to fall. The tension she had been holding finally released into a long, unsteady breath. He will not simply go away, Mrs. Dray said quietly, coming to stand beside her. No, Rosalind agreed. I do not think he will. She spent the rest of that day walking the estate again, though this time with less wandering curiosity and more purpose. She counted every field that lay fallow, every fence that needed mending, every cottage roof that let in the rain. By evening she had filled 3 pages of her notebook with lists, sums, and half-formed plans, none of which yet added up to anything she could call a solution. It was Daniel Ferris she thought to send for the next morning. He arrived on foot, his boots caked with mud from the road, carrying a leather satchel full of tools and drawings. Rosalind met him in the courtyard, where the morning light caught the gray stone of the castle, and made even its broken places look almost handsome. You wish to see me, my lady? I wish to hire you, Mr. Ferris, though I must tell you plainly that I cannot pay you what you are worth, not yet. He set down his satchel and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, one that weighed her words carefully before answering them. What can you pay? A fair wage for now, and a fairer one later, if the estate recovers as I intend it to. I will not lie to you about the risk. I appreciate that more than you know, he said. Most who hire me lie about far smaller things than risk. He glanced up at the castle's crumbling east wing, then back at her. Show me what you have, my lady, all of it, the good and the very bad. She showed him everything. They walked the length of the east wing together, where the floorboard had given way, and he crouched to examine the joists beneath with the careful attention of a man reading a letter from an old friend. They walked to the mill, where he ran his hand along the wheel and pronounced it salvageable, though barely. They walked to the bridge he had been sketching the week before, and he showed her, with quick strokes in his notebook, exactly how he would rebuild it, and for how much less than she had feared. You know this land, she said, watching him work, better than I do, and I have lived here only a month. I grew up 2 villages over, he said, not looking up from his sketch. My father built half the barns in this county before he passed. I have watched Ravenscar fall into ruin since I was a boy. It always seemed a shame to me, a house this fine, left to rot for want of someone who cared enough to save it. And now, he looked up at her then, and something in his gaze made her hold very still. Now I think perhaps it has found someone. They worked together through the rest of that week, drawing up plans for the roof, the bridge, the mill, in an order that would cost the least and save the most. Rosalind found herself looking forward to his arrival each morning more than she was willing to admit, even to Mrs. Dray, who had begun to notice the particular brightness in her eyes whenever Daniel Ferris's name was mentioned. It was Cutter who brought the first real trouble, arriving at the castle gates one evening out of breath, his cap crushed in his hands. "My lady," he said, "you had best come see the sheep pen. Something has gone wrong there, and I do not think it happened on its own." Rosalind followed him down the hill in the fading light, her heart already beating faster than the walk alone could explain. What she found at the pen made her stop cold. The gate had been forced open, the latch broken clean through, and nearly a dozen of Cutter's remaining 40 sheep were gone, scattered into the surrounding woods or worse. "Wolves?" she asked, though she did not believe it even as she said it. Cutter shook his head slowly, crouching to examine the broken latch. "Wolves do not open gates, my lady. This was done by hands." Rosalind knelt beside him and looked at the latch herself. It had not simply broken with age. It had been pried apart, deliberately, by someone who wanted it to look like an accident and had not quite managed the disguise. A cold certainty settled over her, the same cold feeling she had first felt reading Josiah Corbin's letter. "Say nothing of this to the other tenants," she said quietly. "Not yet. I do not want fear to spread faster than the truth." But as she walked back to the castle that night, the stars beginning to show through a break in the clouds, she understood that the quiet, patient work of rebuilding Ravenscar had just become something else entirely. Someone did not want her to succeed, and she intended to find out exactly who. The next morning, Rosalind sent word to every tenant on the estate, asking them to report anything strange they had seen in the past week. Most had nothing to tell her. But an old woman who kept bees near the southern boundary mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had seen a rider pass along the tree line 2 nights before, moving slow and careful, as though he did not wish to be noticed. "Did you see his face?" Rosalind asked. "No, my lady, but I know the horse, a gray mare with a white foot, the kind Mr. Corbin's groom rides when he comes this way." Rosalind thanked her and walked back toward the castle with her mind turning over the information like a stone she could not put down. She had no proof, nothing that would hold up if she made an accusation aloud, and she knew enough of men like Corbin to understand that an accusation without proof would only make her look desperate, or worse, foolish. She found Daniel Ferris at the bridge again that afternoon, measuring the width of the stream with a length of knotted rope. He looked up as she approached, and something in her face must have told him the trouble had not passed. "What has happened?" She told him about the sheep, and the broken latch, and the old woman's gray mare with the white foot. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly as she spoke. "Corbin wants the estate to fail," he said, once she had finished. "If tenants believe the land is cursed, or unlucky, they will stop working it. If the sheep vanish and the crops fail, and every small misfortune piles upon the last, you will have no choice but to sell, whatever your intentions." "I know," Rosalind said. "I simply do not know how to stop him without proof." Daniel was quiet for a moment, coiling his rope slowly. "Then we will have to give him no more misfortunes to use against you. Every fence mended, every gate reinforced, every animal watched. If he wants Ravenscar to look like a ruin, we will make certain it looks like anything but." It was not a solution so much as a promise, but Rosalind found it steadied her all the same. Over the following days, she and Daniel worked from dawn until well past dark, repairing what could be repaired quickly and marking what would take longer. Cutter took to sleeping near the sheep pen himself, a old shepherd's crook within easy reach, and 2 of the younger tenants' sons volunteered, unasked, to walk the eastern boundary each night after Rosalind quietly let it be known she would pay a fair wage for the trouble. Word of the sabotage spread despite her caution, as such things always do in a small county. Some tenants grew more fearful, muttering about bad luck and old curses attached to houses left too long without a proper lord. But others, to Rosalind's quiet surprise, grew more determined, as though the attempt to frighten them had only reminded them what they stood to lose if they let it succeed. Reginald Lyle came to call again near the end of that week, uninvited as always, and found Rosalind in the courtyard directing 2 workmen who had begun repairs on the gatehouse roof. "You look tired, cousin," he said, though his tone suggested he was pleased by the observation rather than concerned. "I am tired," Rosalind admitted. "Tired of watching my husband's estate crumble while he chases surveys abroad, and tired of watching men like Josiah Corbin circle it like carrion birds." Something flickered in Reginald's expression at the mention of Corbin's name, gone too quickly for her to name it. "You suspect him of something, then?" "I suspect a great many things, Reginald. I have not yet decided which of them I can prove." She watched him carefully as she spoke, and thought she saw, just for a moment, something that might have been unease beneath his usual smugness. "Be careful, cousin," he said at last, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "There are men in this county who do not take kindly to being suspected of anything, whether they are guilty or not. Is that a warning, Reginald, or a threat?" He did not answer, only touched his hat and turned back toward his waiting horse, leaving Rosalind standing in the half-repaired courtyard with more questions than she had held before his visit, and a growing certainty that Reginald knew more about Corbin's dealings than he wished to admit. That night, once the workmen had gone and the castle had settled into its usual creaking quiet, Rosalind sat with Mrs. Dray by the fire and laid out everything she had learned. The gray mare with the white foot, Reginald's flicker of unease at Corbin's name, the broken latch that had not broken on its own. "It is not enough to accuse anyone," Mrs. Dray said. "No," Rosalind agreed, "but it is enough to know I am right to be careful, and it is enough to know that whatever Corbin intends, he will not stop simply because I have refused him once." She was right, though she would not fully understand how right until the fire came 3 weeks later, and by then, she and Daniel Ferris had built something between them that neither misfortune nor scheming men would easily be able to tear apart. By late autumn, Ravenscar Castle had begun, slowly and unevenly, to look like a house that someone loved. The roof over the great hall no longer leaked, thanks to 3 weeks of careful work by Daniel Ferris and 2 local men he had trained himself. The gatehouse stood sturdy again, its broken timbers replaced with oak from the estate's own woods, cut and shaped under Daniel's careful direction. The bridge over the stream had been rebuilt entirely, wider and stronger than before, and Rosalind found herself crossing it often, sometimes for no better reason than to admire what determination and honest labor could accomplish. The tenants noticed. Slowly, cottage by cottage, the sullen distance that had greeted Rosalind on her first walks through the estate began to soften into something closer to respect. Cutter's sheep, watched carefully each night since the sabotage, had not lost another to mysterious misfortune, and word of that quiet victory had spread as fast as word of the trouble itself. "You have done in 3 months what your husband's family failed to do in 10 years, Cutter told her one morning, as she helped him move a newly mended fence panel into place. He said it plainly, without flattery, which made it mean more to her than any compliment dressed in finer words. "I have had help," she said, glancing toward the mill, where Daniel's voice could be heard directing the placement of a new wheel. "Aye," Cutter said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Help of a particular kind, if you don't mind my saying, my lady." Rosalind felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with the fence latch rather than answer him directly. She had not spoken aloud, even to Mrs. Dray, of the way her chest tightened whenever Daniel Ferris smiled at some small success, or the way she found herself remembering, at odd hours of the night, the particular sound of his laugh. It was not something she had permitted herself to name. She was, after all, a married woman, whatever distance and neglect had grown between herself and the man she had married. But naming a thing and feeling it, she was beginning to learn, were 2 very different matters entirely. The mill was finished by the first week of the new season, its great wheel turning again for the first time in 3 years, grinding grain for tenants who had been forced to travel 2 villages over, for want of a working mill of their own. Rosalind stood beside Daniel on the day it first turned, watching the water catch the paddles and the wheel groan slowly, then steadily, into motion. "You did that," she said. "We did that," he corrected. "I only knew how. You were the one who decided it mattered enough to fix." She looked at him then, the autumn light catching the sawdust still clinging to his sleeves, and felt something shift inside her chest, something she had been holding carefully in place for weeks finally coming loose. "Daniel," she said, before she could stop herself, "I do not know what I would have done these past months without you." He was quiet for a moment, watching the wheel turn rather than looking at her. "You would have found a way," he said finally. "You are not a woman who waits for rescue, Rosalind. I have watched you long enough to know that much." Then he did look at her, and the careful distance he usually kept in his eyes was gone, replaced by something warmer, something that made her breath catch in her throat. "But I am glad, all the same, that I did not have to watch you do it alone." Neither of them moved closer. Neither of them needed to. The moment held between them, full and quiet, until one of the workmen called out a question about the grain chute, and Daniel turned away to answer it, and the ordinary business of the day folded back around them both. But something had changed, and they both knew it, even if neither spoke of it again that afternoon. Josiah Corbin did not call at the castle again that autumn, though Rosalind heard of him often enough through the county's constant flow of gossip. He had been seen at the market town, buying up small debts from struggling farmers at prices that seemed generous, until one read the fine print of the terms. He had been seen dining with the county magistrate, a man whose good opinion could prove useful to anyone hoping to seize land through means that would not quite survive close scrutiny. And, more troublingly, he had been seen speaking often and at length with Reginald Lyle. Rosalind learned this from Mrs. Dray, who had it from a maid whose sister worked in Corbin's own household, and who had overheard enough to understand that some manner of arrangement was being discussed between the two men, though the precise nature of it remained frustratingly unclear. "They mean to work together," Rosalind said, turning the information over in her mind as she and Mrs. Dray sat together one evening. "If the estate fails and passes to Reginald as the nearest heir, and Reginald is already indebted to Corbin, then Corbin gains the land regardless of what I do here." "Then you must make certain the estate does not fail," Mrs. Dray said simply. "I am trying." Rosalind rubbed her eyes, suddenly aware of how tired she had grown, carrying the weight of ledgers and repairs and rumors all at once. But trying may not be enough, if they mean to force the matter rather than wait for misfortune to do their work for them. She did not have long to wait before she learned exactly what Corbin and Reginald intended, though the answer, when it came, was worse than anything she had imagined. A letter arrived at the end of that week, sealed with the mark of the county court, informing Lady Rosalind Lyle that a formal inquiry had been opened into the management of the Ravenscar estate, on the grounds that its debts had grown so severe as to threaten the safety and welfare of its tenants, and that a hearing would be held within the month to determine whether the estate ought to be placed under alternate management until Lord Geoffrey Lyle's return, or sold outright to settle its obligations. The letter was signed by the county magistrate. Rosalind recognized the name at once as the same man Corbin had lately been so careful to dine with. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time after Mrs. Dray had gone to bed, watching the fire burn low in the grate, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that all the honest work of the past months, the mended roof and the rebuilt bridge, and the mill turning again after 3 years of silence, might not be enough to save Ravenscar, if Corbin and Reginald had already arranged the outcome between them, before the hearing had even begun. She thought of writing out that very night to find Daniel and tell him what had happened. She thought of writing to Geoffrey, though she did not even know an address that might reach him. She thought, briefly and bitterly, of simply giving up, of letting Corbin have his precious ruin, and taking whatever small sum he offered for it, and going somewhere far from this county, where no one knew her name or her failures. But then she thought of Cutter's sheep, safe now behind mended fences. She thought of the tenants who had begun, slowly, to trust her. She thought of the mill wheel turning in the autumn light, and of Daniel's voice saying, "You are not a woman who waits for rescue." She folded the letter carefully, set it on the desk before her, and began, once again, to write. Not a letter of surrender, but a list. Every improvement made since her arrival, every debt repaid, every tenant whose rent had, for the first time in years, been collected in full. If Corbin and Reginald meant to prove Ravenscar unfit to remain in her hands, she would need proof of her own, gathered carefully and presented without a single crack for them to exploit. She worked until the candle burned down to nothing, and when at last she climbed the stairs to her cold, quiet bedroom, she did not feel defeated. She felt, for the first time since the letter had arrived, something closer to fury, clean and useful, the kind of fury that could be turned into purpose if a person was stubborn enough to make it so. She intended to be exactly that stubborn. Word of the inquiry reached Daniel Ferris before Rosalind had the chance to tell him herself, carried by one of the workmen who had heard it discussed at the market town. He came to the castle that same evening, still in his working clothes, his face tight with an anger Rosalind had not seen in him before. "They mean to take it from you before you have even finished mending it," he said, pacing the length of the great hall, while Rosalind sat with the letter still open on the table before her. "A hearing within the month. That is barely time enough to gather half of what you would need to prove yourself." "I know," Rosalind said. "I have been thinking of little else since it arrived." He stopped pacing and looked at her, and some of the anger in his expression softened into something more careful. "Then let us think together. 2 minds will find the gaps a single mind might miss." They worked at the table until well past midnight, Mrs. Dray bringing tea that went cold and forgotten more than once as the hours slipped by. Daniel had a builder's eye for detail that proved invaluable, remembering exact costs and exact dates for every repair he had overseen, figures that Rosalind had recorded but not always with the precision a hostile magistrate might demand. "You will need witnesses," Daniel said, as the candle burned low. "Not only figures on a page. A magistrate already inclined to rule against you will find a way to doubt figures, however honest. He will find it harder to doubt a room full of tenants speaking for themselves. Would they come? Would they speak, knowing it might anger a man like Corbin, who could make trouble for them long after the hearing has ended? Daniel was quiet for a moment. I do not know, but I know Cutter would, and I suspect, if you asked them plainly, more of the others would surprise you than you expect. She did ask them, over the following days, walking again to every cottage she had visited when she first arrived, though this time the reception she found was entirely different. Doors that had once opened cautiously, now opened readily. Tenants who had once answered her questions with short, wary sentences, now spoke at length, of mended roofs and repaired fences, and rents finally worth paying, because the land finally gave something back in return. Not every tenant agreed to speak at the hearing. A few, older and more fearful of drawing the wrong kind of attention, asked to be left out of it, and Rosalind respected their wish without pressing further. But by the end of that week, she had gathered promises from 11 tenants, Cutter among them, willing to stand before the magistrate and speak plainly about the difference 3 months had made. She had gathered something else too, though she had not gone looking for it. Walking home from the last of these visits, in the fading light of an early winter afternoon, she found Daniel waiting for her at the crossroads near the mill, as though he had known, without being told, exactly which path she would take and when. You did not need to wait for me, she said, though she was glad he had. I wanted to. He fell into step beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, the only sound the crunch of frost beginning to form beneath their boots. Rosalind, he said at last, and something in the way he said her name, without the formal title she was still, technically, entitled to, made her heart quicken. Whatever happens at this hearing, I want you to know that the work we have done here these past months has meant more to me than any commission I have taken before it. Not only the building, the company too. She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the dim light his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded, all his usual careful reserve set aside. Daniel, she said, and found she did not know how to finish the thought, because everything she might have said next belonged to a woman free to say it, and she was not. Not entirely. Not while Jeffrey's name still bound her to a house and a title he had abandoned without a backward glance. I know, Daniel said quietly, before she could find the words to explain what she could not offer him. I am not asking anything of you that you cannot give. I only wanted you to know it, before the hearing, before whatever comes next, in case it matters to have said it aloud, whatever else happens. It matters, Rosalind said softly. It matters more than I know how to tell you. They stood together a moment longer in the cold, frosted quiet of the crossroads, closer than propriety strictly allowed, though neither of them closed the last small distance between them. Then, by unspoken agreement, they turned and walked on together toward the castle, the lights of Ravenscar glowing warm and steady in the growing dark ahead. A house that had, against every expectation, begun at last to feel like something worth calling home. Reginald Lyle, watching from the shadow of the trees near the crossroads, saw them pass together and smiled a thin, satisfied smile of his own. He had not expected to find quite so useful a piece of information to bring to Josiah Corbin, but he intended to make full use of it all the same, whatever it cost the woman who had, without ever meaning to, made an enemy of him simply by refusing to fail. The fire started in the east wing, in the very room where the floorboard had once given way beneath Rosalind's careful steps. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of a maid's frightened voice calling her name through the corridor, and for one confused moment she thought she was still dreaming, until the heat of the air told her otherwise. She threw on the first cloak she could find and ran, barefoot, through halls already thick with smoke, following the frightened servants toward the courtyard where the household was gathering in the cold night air. Someone had already sent a boy running to fetch water from the well. Someone else was beating at the nearest flames with wet blankets, though the fire had clearly caught hold before anyone noticed it. Everyone is out? Rosalind called, her voice cracking with smoke and fear both. Count them. Count everyone, now. Mrs. Dray, her hair still in its nightcap, was already moving among the servants, calling names and checking faces against some list only she seemed to carry in her head. All accounted for, my lady, all safe. Relief nearly buckled Rosalind's knees, but there was no time to feel it fully. The fire was spreading along the east wing, the same wing Daniel had spent weeks repairing, and she could see, even from the courtyard, that the new timber he had used would burn as readily as the old. It was Daniel himself who arrived within the hour, roused by one of the tenant boys who had run the distance to his lodgings without stopping to catch his breath along the way. He took command of the effort at once, organizing a line of buckets from the well to the burning wing, directing men to soak blankets and beat down flames before they could climb higher, working alongside the servants and tenants with the same steady competence he brought to every task Rosalind had watched him undertake. They fought the fire for 3 hours before it finally guttered and died, leaving the east wing scorched and ruined but the rest of the castle, remarkably, untouched. Rosalind stood in the gray light of early dawn, soot streaked across her face, and looked at the blackened stone where new timber had stood only hours before. "It was set," Daniel said quietly, standing beside her as the exhausted household began to disperse toward whatever rest they could find. "I have seen enough accidental fires in my work to know the difference. This one started in 3 places at once, along the same wall. That does not happen by chance." "Corbin," Rosalind said, though her voice had gone hollow with exhaustion and fury both. "Or Reginald, working for him. It does not much matter which hand struck the flint, the intent is the same." Rosalind closed her eyes and pressed her palms against them, trying to hold back the tears that threatened, not from grief exactly, but from something closer to rage, hot and helpless all at once. "The hearing is in 10 days, she said. "How am I meant to walk into that room and argue that this estate is thriving under my care, when someone has just proven, quite thoroughly, that it is not safe at all?" "You are meant to walk in and tell the truth," Daniel said. "That someone tried to burn down what you have spent months building, precisely because you were succeeding. That is not a mark against you, Rosalind. It is proof of exactly the opposite." She wanted to believe him. But as she surveyed the ruined wing in the pale morning light, she felt, for the first time since Jeffrey had ridden away, the full weight of how alone she truly was in this fight, whatever comfort Daniel's steady presence offered her. The days that followed were grim ones. Word of the fire spread through the county faster than any of Rosalind's earlier successes ever had, and where her mended roofs and rebuilt bridges had won her slow, grudging respect, the fire seemed to confirm every doubt her critics had ever held. Some tenants, frightened by talk of curses and bad luck, grew distant again, unwilling to be seen too closely tied to a house that seemed to draw disaster. Worse still, when Rosalind sent word to the county constable, asking that the fire be properly investigated, she received only a brief, dismissive reply suggesting the blaze had most likely started from a neglected chimney, a conclusion that conveniently absolved anyone of wrongdoing and left her with no official support for her suspicions. "The magistrate will not want the fire investigated properly," Daniel said grimly when she showed him the constable's letter. "Not if he has already decided which way the hearing ought to end." It was Cutter who came to her 3 days later with something that might, finally, tip the balance in her favor. He arrived at the castle early, before the household had fully woken, his weathered face set with an urgency Rosalind had not seen in him before. "My lady," he said, "my grandson was walking home late the night of the fire, cutting across the eastern fields, the way the young ones do when they think no one's watching. He saw a rider near the castle wall, not long before the smoke started. A gray mare, my lady, white foot on the near side." Rosalind's breath caught. "The same horse the beekeeper saw, near the sheep pen. The very same, I'd wager. And there's more, my lady. My grandson knows that horse well enough, on account of having mucked out its stall more than once for a few coins. It belongs to Mr. Corbin's own groom." It was not proof enough to bring before a magistrate on its own, a boy's account of a horse glimpsed in darkness, but combined with the beekeeper's earlier sighting, combined with the broken latch and the fires set in 3 places along a single wall, it began to form a pattern too consistent to easily dismiss. "Would your grandson speak of it, if I asked him to?" Rosalind asked. "Before the magistrate, I mean. I know it is a great deal to ask of a boy his age." Cutter considered this for a long moment, his jaw working. "He's frightened, my lady, and I won't pretend otherwise. But he's a good lad, and he knows right from wrong plain enough. I believe, if you asked him proper, and if I stood beside him while he spoke, he would find the courage for it." Rosalind thanked him with a warmth that made the old shepherd's weathered face soften, just slightly, into something almost like a smile. It was not enough, not yet, to guarantee the outcome she needed, but it was more than she had held before that morning, and in the days remaining before the hearing, she intended to gather every remaining piece she could find, however small, until the pattern became impossible for even a bought magistrate to ignore. Daniel worked alongside her through those final days with a quiet, steady determination that steadied her own resolve in turn, even as the scorched east wing stood as a constant, blackened reminder of exactly what they were fighting against. They spoke little of the moment at the crossroads, though it lingered between them in every glance, every unnecessary touch of hands passing papers back and forth across the desk in the estate office. There was no time, in those crowded, urgent days, for anything but the fight ahead. But Rosalind found, even amid the fear and the fury, a strange and steady comfort in knowing that whatever the hearing decided, she would not face it entirely alone. 2 days before the hearing, Rosalind rode into the market town herself, determined to speak with anyone who might have seen or heard something useful, however small. She visited the blacksmith, who had shoed Corbin's gray mare more than once and confirmed, without being asked directly, that the horse had a distinctive white marking on its near foot that made it easy to recognize even at a distance. She visited the innkeeper, who mentioned, almost in passing, that Corbin's groom had taken a room for 2 nights the week of the fire, though his master's business in the county was said to have concluded days before. It was a small thing, a groom staying on longer than his master's stated business required, but small things, Rosalind was learning, had a way of adding together into something far less small when enough of them were gathered in one place. She returned to Ravenscar that evening tired but not discouraged, and found Daniel waiting for her in the courtyard, a lantern in his hand against the early winter dark. "You should not be riding these roads alone," he said, though there was more worry than reproach in his voice. "Not with what we suspect Corbin capable of." "I could not simply wait for the hearing to come to me," she said, dismounting stiffly after the long ride. "Every piece we gather matters now." He took the reins from her without being asked, leading her horse toward the stable while she walked beside him, and told him what she had learned in town. He listened carefully, as he always did, weighing each detail with the same careful attention he gave to a cracked beam or a failing joist. "It is enough to raise real doubt," he said finally. "Perhaps not enough to prove Corbin's hand directly, but enough, laid alongside everything else, to make a fair magistrate hesitate before ruling against you." "And if the magistrate is not fair?" Daniel did not answer that at once. When he did, his voice had gone quieter, more serious than she had heard it before. "Then we will have done everything honest effort could do, and whatever happens after that will not be a failure of your own making. Remember that, Rosalind, whatever the hearing decides. You have built something real here. No ruling in a county courtroom can undo the roof that no longer leaks, or the mill that turns again, or the tenants who trust you now in a way they never trusted the man who left you here alone." She looked at him in the lantern light, soot still faintly visible along his sleeve from the night of the fire, and felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsteady for weeks. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it as the frightened bride Geoffrey had abandoned. She was facing it as a woman who had built something worth defending, with her own hands and her own will, and with the steady, quiet support of a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. The night before the hearing, sleep would not come. Rosalind sat in the estate office long after Mrs. Dray had retired, going over her papers one final time by candlelight, checking every figure, every witness account, every small piece of evidence that might, together, prove enough to save the home she had come to love more fiercely than she had ever expected to. Through the window she could see the scorched outline of the east wing against the night sky, a dark reminder of everything Corbin and Reginald had already tried to take from her. But she could see, too, the mended roof of the great hall, and the rebuilt bridge beyond it catching moonlight on the stream below, and she found, gathering her papers together at last and blowing out the candle, that fear had given way, somewhere in the long months since Geoffrey's departure, to something far more useful, resolve, and she intended to carry every ounce of it into the courtroom the following morning. The county courtroom was fuller than Rosalind had expected when she arrived the next morning, Mrs. Dray at her side, and a leather case of carefully ordered papers held tight against her chest. Word of the hearing had spread through every village for miles, and it seemed half the county had come to see whether the young bride left behind at Ravenscar would save her husband's estate or lose it entirely. Josiah Corbin sat near the front of the room, composed and unhurried, exchanging quiet words with the magistrate's clerk, as though he had already arranged the outcome and was merely waiting for the formality of the hearing to catch up with what had been decided. Reginald Lyle sat a few rows behind him, his expression carefully neutral, though Rosalind caught him watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The magistrate, a heavy-set man named Justice Colford, called the room to order and read the terms of the inquiry aloud in a flat, official voice. The estate's debts, the state of disrepair reported at the start of the season, the question of whether Lady Lyle possessed either the means or the competence to manage Ravenscar in her husband's continued absence. "Lady Lyle," Colford said, once the formalities had concluded, "you may present your case." Rosalind rose, her hands steady despite the pounding of her own heart, and began. She spoke first of the ledgers, laying out in careful detail every debt repaid since her arrival, every rent finally collected after years of neglect. She spoke of the roof, mended before the winter rains could do further damage, and the bridge rebuilt wider and stronger than the one it replaced. She spoke of the mill, silent for 3 years, now turning again and grinding grain for tenants who no longer had to travel 2 villages over for want of a working wheel. "These are not the actions of a woman incapable of managing an estate," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. "They are the actions of a woman who has spent every day since her husband's departure working to save what he was willing to abandon." A murmur ran through the room at that, and she saw, from the corner of her eye, Corbin's composed expression tighten just slightly. Then she called her witnesses. Cutter spoke first, his weathered voice steady despite the unfamiliar grandeur of the courtroom, describing the state of his flock before Rosalind's arrival, and the careful, patient work that had restored both the sheep pen and his own trust in the estate's future. 10 more tenants followed, each speaking briefly but plainly of mended cottages, repaired fences, and rents made bearable again by land finally given the care it had long been denied. "And the fire, Lady Lyle?" Colford asked, once the tenant testimonies had concluded, his tone carrying an edge of skepticism that told Rosalind he had heard, and perhaps believed, the constable's dismissive report of a neglected chimney. How does an estate under such careful new management come to burn in 3 places along a single wall? This was the moment Rosalind had prepared for most carefully, and she felt Daniel's steady presence at the back of the room, though he had not been permitted to sit among the witnesses, watching her with quiet, unwavering support. "It does not burn by accident, Justice Colford," she said. "I have brought witnesses who can speak to that as well." Cutter's grandson was called next, a boy of perhaps 12 who stood nervously before the crowded room, until his grandfather's steady hand on his shoulder seemed to settle him enough to speak. He described, haltingly at first and then with growing confidence, the gray mare with the white foot he had seen near the castle wall the night of the fire, a horse he knew well from mucking out its stall for a few coins on more than one occasion. "And whose horse was that, boy?" Colford asked. The boy glanced at Corbin, seated near the front of the room, his composed expression finally beginning to crack at the edges. "It belongs to Mr. Corbin's groom, sir. I've seen him ride it into the village a dozen times or more." The murmur that ran through the courtroom this time was louder, more insistent, and Rosalind saw the magistrate's expression shift, just slightly, from bored skepticism into something closer to genuine attention. The beekeeper spoke next, confirming her own earlier sighting of the same gray mare near the sheep pen the night the latch was broken. The innkeeper, whom Rosalind had asked to attend and had, to her relief, agreed, confirmed that Corbin's groom had remained in the county 2 full days after his master's stated business had concluded, with no clear explanation offered for the delay. By the time the final witness had finished speaking, the pattern Rosalind had spent weeks gathering piece by careful piece stood laid bare before the entire courtroom, plain enough that even a magistrate inclined to favor Corbin's version of events could not easily dismiss it. Corbin rose then, his composure fully restored, though a careful observer might have noticed the slight tightness around his eyes that had not been there at the start of the hearing. "Justice Colford, I would remind the court that a boy's account of a horse glimpsed at night, and an innkeeper's vague recollection of a groom's travel plans, hardly constitute proof of anything beyond coincidence. I have offered nothing but honest assistance to Lady Lyle throughout this unfortunate business, and I resent the implication otherwise." "You offered to buy my husband's estate within a week of his departure," Rosalind said, before the magistrate could respond. "You offered again after the fire that destroyed my east wing, at a price considerably lower than your first generous offer, once you had reason to believe I might be desperate enough to accept it. I have the letters, Justice Colford, should the court wish to see them." She produced the letters from her leather case, both dated and both signed in Corbin's own careful hand, and passed them forward for the magistrate's inspection. Colford read them slowly, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line, while Corbin's composure finally, visibly, began to fray at the edges. It was Reginald who broke first, though Rosalind had not expected the confession to come from him at all. Perhaps it was the weight of the courtroom's growing suspicion, or perhaps it was simply that Reginald had never possessed the same cold nerve as the man he had allied himself with. Whatever the reason, he rose from his seat, his face pale, and spoke before anyone had asked him to. "I knew," he said, his voice unsteady. "I knew what Corbin intended, and I said nothing, because I believed the estate would pass to me regardless, once it failed, and I saw no reason to prevent what seemed, at the time, inevitable. But I did not set the fire myself, Justice Colford, and I will not stand here and be made to answer for a crime I did not commit with my own hands. whatever I may have known of another man's intentions. The courtroom erupted into noise at that, a dozen conversations breaking out at once, until Colford's gavel restored something like order. Corbin, seeing the alliance he had built with Reginald crumbling in real time before the entire county, made one final attempt to salvage his position, insisting the boy's testimony proved nothing, and the letters were simply the ordinary business of a man offering fair terms to a struggling widow. "She is not a widow, Mr. Corbin," Colford said dryly, his patience for the man's protests clearly exhausted. "Her husband remains, as I understand it, quite alive, if regrettably absent. And I have heard enough today to satisfy myself that whatever misfortunes have befallen Ravenscar this season were considerably less accidental than your groom's gray mare would have this court believe." He turned to address the full courtroom, his voice taking on the formal cadence of an official ruling. "It is the finding of this inquiry that Lady Rosalind Lyle has demonstrated more than sufficient competence in the management of the Ravenscar estate, and considerably more diligence than the circumstances of her husband's absence might reasonably have required of her. The petition to place the estate under alternate management, or to compel its sale, is hereby dismissed." The relief that flooded through Rosalind was so sudden and so complete that she had to grip the edge of the table before her to keep her knees steady beneath it. Around her, the courtroom buzzed with fresh conversation, tenants who had testified on her behalf exchanging quiet, satisfied nods, while Corbin gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements and left the room without a backward glance. Forford was not finished, however. He fixed his attention on Corbin's retreating back and added, in a voice loud enough to carry, "I would further direct the county constable to reopen his investigation into the fire at Ravenscar, with rather more thoroughness than his first, remarkably brief report suggested. I suspect he will find considerably more to answer for than a neglected chimney." Rosalind sank into her chair as the courtroom slowly began to empty, Mrs. Dray's hand finding hers and squeezing tight. Cutter approached, his weathered face split by a broad, unguarded smile, to thank her for what she had done, though it seemed to Rosalind that the thanks ought to run the other direction entirely. It was Daniel she looked for first, once she had recovered enough to rise from her chair, and found him waiting near the courtroom doors, his own relief plain and unguarded on his face in a way she had rarely seen from him before. "You did it," he said as she reached him. "We did it," she corrected, echoing his own words back to him from the day the mill had first turned again. "I could not have gathered half of what I presented today without you standing beside me through every step of it." He looked as though he wanted to say more, something that had been building in him through all the long, difficult weeks since the fire, but the crowded courtroom hallway was no place for such words, and they both seemed to understand that without needing to speak it aloud. Instead, he simply offered his arm, and she took it, and together they walked out into the cold winter sunlight, the estate saved, the county's opinion turned decisively in her favor, and something unspoken between them growing steadier and more certain with every step they took together. But the victory, however sweet, was not the end of the story. Word reached Ravenscar only 4 days later that Lord Geoffrey Lyle had at last taken ship for home. His commission abroad concluded in circumstances that the letter, brief and evasive, declined to fully explain. He was expected to arrive within the fortnight, and Rosalind understood, reading the letter by the light of a fire in a hall she had saved with her own hands, that the hardest part of her story might not yet be behind her after all. Geoffrey Lyle arrived at Ravenscar on a gray afternoon in early winter, riding through the same gates he had ridden out of nearly a year before, though the man who returned looked little like the confident young lord who had left. He had grown thin, and a scar ran along one side of his jaw that had not been there when he departed, and he rode not with the easy grace Rosalind remembered, but with the careful stiffness of a man still recovering from some injury he had not yet fully described in his letters. Rosalind watched him approach from the same courtyard where she had watched him leave, though everything else about the scene had changed entirely. The roof above her no longer leaked. The gatehouse stood sturdy and repaired. Tenants who had once eyed her with wary distance now moved about their work with the easy familiarity of people who trusted the woman directing them, and several paused to watch their lord's return with expressions that held far more curiosity than welcome. Geoffrey dismounted slowly, wincing slightly as his boots hit the stone, and looked around the courtyard with an expression Rosalind could not quite read. Surprise, certainly, and beneath it, something that might have been shame, or might simply have been the disorientation of a man returning to find everything different from how he had left it. "Rosalind," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, "you look well." "I am well," she said. "The estate is well too, if you had thought to ask after it before yourself." He flinched slightly at that, and glanced around the courtyard again, taking in the mended roof, the rebuilt gatehouse, the general air of quiet, purposeful activity that had not existed when he rode away. I can see that. I confess I hardly recognize the place. A great deal has happened in your absence, Geoffrey. More than I can explain standing here in the cold. She gestured toward the great hall, its doors standing open and warm light spilling out from the fire within. Come inside. You look as though you need rest more than conversation, and both can wait until you have had a chance to recover from your journey. He followed her inside, and over the following days, as he slowly regained his strength, Rosalind told him everything that had happened since his departure. The debts she had uncovered in the ledgers he had never fully explained, Corbin's attempts to buy the estate out from under her, and later to seize it through sabotage and false testimony. The fire that had nearly cost her everything, and the hearing that had, in the end, saved it. She told him of Cutter and the other tenants who had come to trust her, and of Reginald's quiet betrayal, now known throughout the county, and likely to cost him whatever standing he had once held. She did not tell him, at first, of Daniel Ferris, though she suspected, from the way Geoffrey's eyes moved carefully over the rebuilt bridge and the mended roof, that he had already guessed at least part of what she had left unspoken. Who built all this? He asked one evening, as they sat together in the great hall, the fire between them casting long shadows across a room that had once been cold and half ruined, and was now, unmistakably, a home. A local builder, Rosalind said carefully, Mr. Daniel Ferris. Without his skill and his willingness to work for less than he was worth while the estate could not afford more, none of this would have been possible. Geoffrey was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an attentiveness he had rarely shown before his departure. And is that all he was to you, Rosalind? A builder, working for less than he was worth? She met his gaze steadily, unwilling to lie about something that had, in the end, remained honorable even in its quiet intensity. He became a friend. A true one, of the kind I did not have in this house before you left it, and did not have from you, if I am honest, even before that. I will not pretend otherwise, Geoffrey, and I will not apologize for a friendship that helped save what you were willing to abandon. Geoffrey looked away first, staring into the fire with an expression that held more weariness than anger. I do not think I have any right to ask more than that of you, he said quietly. I left you here with nothing, Rosalind. Less than nothing, if the ledgers I have since read are any indication of what this place truly owed. I told myself, riding away, that you would manage, because I could not bear to admit that I was running from a burden I did not know how to carry myself. That was a coward's reasoning, and I have had a long year at sea to understand it fully. It was the closest thing to an honest apology she had ever heard from him, and it surprised her, coming from a man she had long since stopped expecting honesty from at all. What happened to you, Geoffrey? The scar, the commission that ended so suddenly, and so badly, from what your letters suggested. He told her then, briefly and without much detail, of a survey gone wrong in unfamiliar territory, of an injury that had nearly cost him his leg entirely, of long months of recovery in a foreign port that had given him little to do but think, with growing and uncomfortable clarity, about the choices that had brought him there in the first place. I do not expect you to forgive me for leaving, he said finally. I am not certain I have forgiven myself for it, watching what you have built here without any help from me at all. But I hope, in time, we might find some way forward, even if it is not the marriage either of us imagined when we stood before the altar together. Rosalind considered his words carefully, watching the fire burn low between them, and felt, for the first time since his return, that she understood exactly what she wanted her own answer to be. I do not think I can be the wife you left behind, Geoffrey, she said. That woman is gone, and I do not believe she is coming back, even for you. I have built something here that belongs to me as much as it belongs to this family's name, and I will not set it aside now, nor will I set aside the friendships that helped me build it, simply because you have returned and wish things to resume as they once were. I do not ask that of you, Geoffrey said. I am not certain I have the right to ask anything of you at all. They spoke for a long while longer that night, working out, slowly, and without the anger either of them might once have brought to such a conversation, what kind of future they might build from the ruins of what their marriage had been. Geoffrey, to Rosalind's quiet surprise, did not fight to reclaim the authority he had once held over the estate's management. He had seen enough, in his brief days home, to understand that Ravenscar's recovery belonged to Rosalind in a way his own name never could have earned it, and he seemed, whether from genuine humility or simple exhaustion, willing to let that recognition stand. News of Geoffrey's return, and of the quiet, complicated arrangement that followed it, spread through the county nearly as quickly as news of the hearing had, but where the county's opinion of Rosalind had once been uncertain, Shaped by doubt and Corbin's careful rumors, it was now firmly, unshakably in her favor. She was invited to dine with families who had once considered her beneath their notice. Tenants from estates well beyond Ravenscar's own boundaries began asking after her methods, curious whether the same careful, patient work that had restored her husband's crumbling castle might restore their own struggling lands as well. It was at a county gathering held that winter, a grand affair meant to celebrate the season's harvest despite the hardships many estates had faced, that Rosalind's transformation from abandoned bride to the county's quiet pride became impossible for anyone to deny. She arrived with Geoffrey at her side, a careful, respectful distance maintained between them that spoke more honestly of their arrangement than any public announcement could have managed, and found herself, within minutes of entering the hall, surrounded by neighbors eager to hear, in her own words, exactly how she had accomplished what an entire county had assumed impossible. Daniel Ferris was there as well, invited on the strength of his own growing reputation as the builder responsible for some of the county's finest recent restorations, Ravenscar chief among them. He kept a respectful distance through most of the evening, as propriety demanded, but found a moment, late in the night, to draw Rosalind aside near a quiet window overlooking the frosted gardens beyond. "You have become quite the celebrated figure," he said, a familiar warmth in his voice that made her smile despite the formal setting around them. "I have become exactly what I always intended to become," she said, "a woman who refused to let a crumbling castle, or the man who left it to her, determine what she was capable of." "And Geoffrey, what becomes of that, now that he has returned?" Rosalind glanced across the crowded hall to where Geoffrey stood, engaged in careful, formal conversation with the very magistrate who had so nearly ruled against her months before. "We have found a kind of peace, I think, not the marriage either of us once imagined, but an honest one, built on what remains true between us, rather than what we once pretended to feel. He will manage the estate's dealings with the wider county. I will manage everything else, as I have managed it since the day he rode away." "And is there room, in that arrangement, for anything else?" Daniel asked quietly, his eyes holding hers with a directness that made her breath catch, just as it had at the crossroads all those months before. She did not answer him immediately, not because she did not know her own heart, but because the answer she wished to give belonged to a conversation better held away from the crowded, curious eyes of the county's finest families. "Walk with me tomorrow," she said instead. "To the bridge, perhaps. I find I have grown rather fond of that particular spot, for reasons I suspect you understand better than anyone else in this room." The smile that broke across his face then was unguarded, warm enough to banish every trace of the cold winter night pressing against the window beside them, and Rosalind understood, watching it, that whatever shape her future finally took, she would not be facing it without the steady, patient man who had helped her save a crumbling castle, and, in doing so, helped her discover exactly what she was capable of building, given the chance, and her own stubborn will to try. Ravenscar Castle stood that winter as it had not stood in a generation, its roof sound, its bridge sturdy, its mill turning steadily for tenants who had learned, alongside its lady, that ruin was never quite so permanent as it first appeared, provided someone stubborn enough refused to accept it. Spring came to Ravenscar earlier than usual that year, or so it seemed to Rosalind, who had spent the long winter months watching the estate she had fought so hard to save begin, slowly and steadily, to flourish in ways she had not dared hope for during those first desperate weeks after Geoffrey's departure. The fields Cutter had once described as fallow now showed the first green shoots of a planting season handled with far more care than the estate had known in years. The mended roof over the great hall held firm through every storm the season threw against it, and the mill turned steadily, day after day, grinding grain not only for Ravenscar's own tenants but for two neighboring estates whose lords had come, hat in hand, to ask whether Rosalind might spare some portion of her mill's newfound capacity for their own struggling harvests. Josiah Corbin did not trouble Ravenscar again. The constable's reopened investigation into the fire had uncovered enough evidence in the end to see Corbin's groom charged with arson, and though Corbin himself managed to avoid direct prosecution through careful use of his remaining wealth and connections, his reputation throughout the county had been thoroughly and permanently ruined. Few families continued to receive him, and fewer still trusted his offers of financial assistance, having watched, with the rest of the county, exactly what such offers had nearly cost the young Lady Lyle. Reginald Lyle fared little better. Stripped of any hope of inheriting an estate that had, under Rosalind's careful management, become the very picture of prosperity, rather than the failing ruin he had once counted on, he retreated from county society altogether, his name mentioned less and less as the months passed, until he became little more than a cautionary tale told at dinner parties about the dangers of betting against a woman determined to prove herself. Jeffrey remained at Ravenscar through the spring, though the marriage he and Rosalind maintained bore little resemblance to the union either of them had entered so hastily nearly 2 years before. They managed the estate's affairs together, Jeffrey handling the formal business of tenant contracts and county obligations that still required a lord's signature, while Rosalind continued the deeper work of restoration and management that had earned her the county's respect in the first place. Between them grew something quieter than love, but sturdier than mere obligation, a genuine partnership built on honesty, rather than the illusions either had once carried into their marriage. It was Jeffrey himself who suggested, one evening in early summer, that Rosalind might find greater happiness in a life that did not require her to remain bound to a marriage neither of them any longer pretended was anything but a practical arrangement. "I have watched you these past months," he said, as they sat together in the estate office, the ledgers between them now healthy and balanced in a way neither of them could have imagined a year before. "You have built something extraordinary here, Rosalind, and you built it without needing me at all. I do not think it fair, any longer, to hold you to promises we made before either of us understood what marriage would actually require of us." "What are you suggesting, Jeffrey?" "A quiet separation, managed with as much discretion and as little scandal as the county will allow. I will retain my title and my formal obligations to Ravenscar's tenants, but the estate's true management, and the credit for its recovery, belongs entirely to you. I do not intend to take that from you, whatever the law might technically allow me to claim." It was, Rosalind understood, as generous an offer as Jeffrey Lyle had ever made her, and perhaps the most honest thing he had said to her since the day he first proposed marriage. She accepted it not with the relief of a woman escaping an unwanted bond, but with the quiet gratitude of two people who had, against considerable odds, found a way to part as something closer to friends than the strangers they had become during his long absence. The arrangement was managed carefully, as Jeffrey had promised, and though county gossip inevitably found its way around the details, the story that spread was, for once, kinder to Rosalind than harsh. She was not painted as a wife who had failed her marriage, but as a woman who had saved an entire estate through her own strength and skill, only to discover, in the process, that she deserved a life built on more than duty alone. Daniel Ferris asked her to marry him on the same bridge where they had first properly spoken, nearly 2 years after that first meeting, kneeling on the very stones he had rebuilt with his own hands, in the golden light of a late summer evening. Rosalind said yes before he had even finished the question, laughing through tears that surprised them both with how readily they came, and the wedding that followed, held in the newly restored gardens of Ravenscar Castle itself, drew nearly every family in the county eager to celebrate a match that felt, to all who witnessed it, entirely and rightfully earned. Cutter attended, of course, along with every tenant whose trust Rosalind had won through months of honest, patient work, and Mrs. Dray stood beside her throughout the ceremony, with the quiet pride of a woman who had watched her charge grow from a frightened bride into a figure the entire county now spoke of, with genuine admiration. Jeffrey attended too, standing at the edge of the celebration with an expression that held more peace than regret, and when Rosalind found a private moment to thank him, once again, for the generosity of the arrangement that had made her new happiness possible, he simply smiled and told her that watching her build something so extraordinary from the ruin he had left behind had taught him more about courage than any survey commission ever could have managed. Ravenscar Castle stood, in the years that followed, as one of the finest estates in the entire county, its history quietly reshaped in the telling, from a tale of a lord's abandonment into a story of a lady's determination. Visitors who came to admire its mended towers and thriving fields often asked after the young lord who had once ridden away and left it to ruin, only to be told, more often than not, that the true story of Ravenscar belonged not to the man who had abandoned it, but to the woman who had refused to let it fall. Rosalind Ferris, as she was known from that summer forward, continued the work she had begun in those first desperate weeks after Jeffrey's departure for the rest of her days, expanding Ravenscar's prosperity year after year, and lending her hard-won knowledge to neighboring estates whose own struggles reminded her, always, of exactly how far she and Ravenscar had come together. Daniel worked alongside her in equal partnership, his skill and hers combining to make Ravenscar not merely restored but genuinely, lastingly transformed, a house that generations after would still speak of as the county's pride, and the clearest possible proof that a crumbling castle, however badly abandoned, could always be rebuilt by hands stubborn enough and hearts brave enough to try.